Hello everyone, I'm John, and welcome back to another whispered true crime story shared softly to calm your mind while revealing the hidden dangers of real life. These are not just stories to pass the time, they are true events, and each one carries a lesson. I don't want you to only listen. I want you to learn so you never fall into the same traps, so you never become the next victim. Share this with your family and friends because protecting them may start with something as simple as this story. And I know many of you use these whispers to fall asleep, but before you drift away, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share. It may feel small, but it's the only way this channel survives and the only reason I can keep whispering these true cases night after night. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I love seeing how far these whispers travel across the world. So don't put it off until tomorrow. Do it now, before sleep takes you away. Now relax, slow your breathing, and let's begin tonight's case. Story 1. Some crimes shock a nation so deeply that they leave scars which never fade. Among the long list of tragic cases that Britain has ever witnessed, one stands apart. It is the story of a little boy, known to the world simply as Baby P. His face, innocent, cherubic, with wide blue eyes, became a symbol of a system that failed its most vulnerable child. When adults lose their lives to crime, it is painful, unjust, and tragic. But when the victim is a child, something inside us reacts with even more force. We instinctively know that children are the most innocent members of our society. They depend on others for food, for care, for protection, and for love. They have no defenses of their own. To hurt them is to strike at the very foundation of humanity itself. That is why child murder is seen as one of the most horrific acts imaginable. It is not only a killing, it is a betrayal of trust, a violation of the duty every adult owes to the young. In the case of Baby P, what made it unbearable was not just the crime itself, but the long series of warnings, missed opportunities, and ignored signs that led up to it. For months, the boy's life unfolded in plain sight of authorities. Doctors, social workers, police. He was seen more than 60 times in under a year. Each time, there were clues. Each time, there were questions. But still, he was sent back to the very place where he was in danger. And in the end, he did not survive. This case became one of the most infamous child protection scandals in the United Kingdom. It led to national outrage, public debate, and questions that still echo today. How could such a tragedy happen in modern Britain? How could a child be left to suffer in plain view? And why did the very people meant to keep him safe fail him so completely? As we begin this story, it is important to understand that it is not simply about one child, one family, or one terrible crime. It is about cycles of neglect that pass from generation to generation. It is about vulnerable children born into unstable homes, where chaos, violence, and addiction take root. And it is about a system stretched so thin, underfunded, and overwhelmed that sometimes the most important warning signs are missed. But before we explore the shocking details of Baby P's short life, we must first look back, because the path to his tragedy began long before he was born, in the troubled childhood of his mother, Tracy Connolly. To understand what would one day happen to Baby P, we must first step back into the early life of his mother, Tracy Connolly. Her own childhood was marked by instability, hardship, and neglect. These early years shaped her character, her choices, and the kind of environment she would later create for her children. Tracy was born in Leicester on the 29th of January 1981. She grew up in a household already weighed down by addiction and struggle. Her mother, Mary O'Connor, battled both drug use and alcohol dependency. Her father, Gary Connolly, was a travelling salesman, often away, leaving the home environment fragile and unsettled. Tracy had one older brother, but despite having a sibling, her early years were far from secure. Mary, Tracy's mother, had her own tragic past. As a child, she had been physically abused by her father and later sexually assaulted by another relative. These experiences left deep scars that carried forward into adulthood. Instead of breaking the cycle, Mary repeated it. The violence and trauma she suffered as a girl seemed to feed into her own destructive behaviors, and sadly, her children would also come to live through the consequences, This created a chain reaction, one generation passing down pain to the next. In the Connolly household, the children grew up surrounded by violence, instability, and addiction. Arguments and domestic abuse became part of everyday life. For a child, such experiences create confusion and fear. Instead of feeling safe and nurtured, Tracy lived in an environment where chaos was the norm. It is often said that children learn about relationships by watching their parents. For Tracy, what she saw was not stability or care, but tension, neglect, and abuse. These early lessons in family life had a long-lasting effect. The violence her mother endured and later inflicted shaped Tracy's understanding of how people lived together. Social workers and psychologists often point out that when a child grows up in such surroundings, the effects are not only emotional but practical. Hygiene may be neglected, school attendance may slip, a child may be bullied because of how they look or smell, and this in turn deepens their sense of being different and unwanted. Tracy would experience much of this. Even as a young girl, she was often left to care for herself. There were times when her clothes were not clean, when her hygiene was poor, and when she seemed neglected. At school, this made her stand out. Other children noticed, and instead of showing compassion, they singled her out. She became a target for bullying. For a child already suffering at home, this only added to the pain. Tracy's schooling was disrupted. Teachers saw the signs of a child who needed more support, both educationally and emotionally. She was eventually moved into special educational provision, taken away from mainstream schooling. She was sent to a residential reform school in 1993, a placement intended to help her get the attention and structure she needed. This decision may have saved her from something even worse. Around the same time, a major child abuse scandal broke out in a number of residential homes across the UK. Many children placed in those institutions suffered terrible abuse. By chance, Tracy avoided that specific horror, but her years at reform school were still far from easy. The scars of her early family life never left her. Instead of growing stronger from those years, she came out carrying the weight of instability, neglect, and trauma. The lessons she learned were not of love, care, and safety, but of survival in a home where none of those things were guaranteed. As Tracy moved into her teenage years, this difficult foundation would lead her into choices and relationships that shaped the course of her life, and ultimately, the fate of her youngest child. As Tracy grew older, the shadows of her childhood only seemed to deepen. The abuse her mother had suffered, and the neglect Tracy herself endured, created a pattern that kept repeating inside the family. Violence and addiction had become almost normal in their household, and the children were left to witness it day after day. Mary O'Connor, her mother, was not only trapped in her own addictions, but also locked in destructive relationships. Domestic violence became part of Tracy's world. She grew up watching her mother in conflict, often in the presence of boyfriends who controlled and hurt her. These experiences left their mark. For a young girl, watching constant arguments, violence, and chaos, the lessons about family life were deeply damaging. Tracy herself was often neglected. She was sometimes left without proper care, her personal hygiene ignored. Teachers noticed, children noticed, and soon she became an outcast. She was bullied for looking different, for smelling unclean, for being the girl who came from a broken home. Instead of receiving compassion, she was singled out and made to feel even smaller. Reports from that time suggest that Tracy was not without intelligence. She was capable, and in another life she might have succeeded, but her behavior and reputation began to take over. She became known as a disruptive student, someone who could not settle. Eventually, the authorities decided she needed special education provision. She was taken out of mainstream school and placed into a residential reform school in 1993. At first, it seemed like this could have been a turning point. Reform schools were supposed to give structure and care to young people who struggled in regular schools, but the reality was different. Life in those institutions was harsh, and many children suffered. In fact, one of Tracy's male relatives, also in the system at that time, was targeted by a paedophile ring linked to residential homes. Tracy managed to avoid that particular horror, but she was not untouched. During her time at reform school, she herself was sexually abused by a relative. It was yet another violation, another painful scar added to the already long list of traumas. Instead of building resilience, these experiences only pushed Tracy further into dysfunction. The cycle of abuse that had begun with her mother's childhood continued through her own. Neglect, violence, and exploitation were passed down like a dark inheritance. As she left her teenage years behind, Tracy entered adulthood, carrying the weight of all this damage. She had not known stability, she had not been nurtured, and she had not been protected. These early scars shaped the choices she would later make, choices that would bring dangerous men into her life and into the lives of her children. But before that, she entered her first serious relationship, one that seemed, at least for a time, to offer her something better. As Tracy entered her teenage years, the instability of her family home followed her closely. Her upbringing had already been scarred by neglect, but now the effects began to show more clearly. Her mother, Mary, was caught in a cycle of addiction and violence. The men who came into the house often brought trouble. Tracy saw domestic abuse unfold before her eyes. She grew up in an atmosphere of shouting, fighting, and control. Instead of protection, she witnessed fear. Instead of stability, she lived with chaos. For a child, those early lessons matter. Children learn how to behave and how to love by watching the adults around them. What Tracy learned was damaging. Arguments, violence, and neglect became her picture of normal life. As she grew older, she carried these lessons with her. She developed attachment issues, a sense of abandonment, and anger that often spilled into her behavior. Her household, already unstable, shaped her in ways that would influence her decisions for years to come. There were times when she saw her mother in violent relationships, and the impact on Tracy was lasting. The pain of those experiences added to the wounds she already carried. Instead of breaking free from the cycle, it seemed as if the same shadows were pulling her forward. These patterns would follow her into her own relationships. Just as her mother had been drawn into destructive partnerships, Tracy too would find herself with men who were controlling, violent, or dangerous. The violence she witnessed as a girl became a thread that wove itself into her adult life. By the time she moved into adulthood, Tracy was already repeating the same story her mother had lived. The cycle of abuse and neglect was passing from one generation to the next, and it would soon place her own children at risk. But before that, Tracy entered her first serious relationship, one that, at least for a while, seemed to offer her something different. Tracy Connolly's teenage years carried the same difficulties she had faced as a child, only now the consequences became sharper. School life was one of the first places where the neglect at home showed clearly. Teachers noticed she often looked unkempt, her hygiene was poor, her clothes were not clean, and she seemed different from other children. This did not go unnoticed by classmates, who targeted her. She was bullied for the way she looked, for the way she smelled, for coming from a household where care was lacking. Instead of being shown kindness, she was singled out. This bullying added to the sense of abandonment she already felt. At home, she did not receive enough care, and at school she was treated as an outsider. The result was that she carried both shame and anger. Reports later described her as not without intelligence. She was not incapable of learning, but her behavior, her difficulties, and her reputation began to overshadow her potential. It became clear that mainstream school was not working for her. Authorities believed she needed special educational support, something more structured than a regular classroom. In 1993, Tracy was placed in a residential reform school. On paper, a reform school was meant to provide stability and discipline, a place where troubled children could receive proper attention, but the reality was often much darker. Life inside these institutions could be harsh, and many children experienced further harm rather than help. During this same period, a major child abuse scandal emerged in Britain. Across several residential homes, including those near where Tracy lived, children were targeted by paedophile rings. Some of her own relatives became victims of this exploitation. One male relative, also placed in the care system, was sexually abused during this time. Tracy avoided being placed in the same children's home where this widespread abuse occurred, but her own life was far from safe. In the 1990s, while still young, she too became a victim of sexual abuse at the hands of a relative. The pattern of trauma continued. Instead of finding protection and stability, Tracy's years in the system only deepened the scars she carried. She was growing into a young woman, but she was doing so without the foundation of love, guidance, or security. By the time she left school and moved further into adolescence, she had already learned lessons no child should ever learn. Neglect, bullying, and abuse had shaped her outlook. And now, as she entered her mid-teens, she began forming relationships of her own, relationships that carried the weight of everything she had already endured. By the time Tracy reached her mid-teens, she was already carrying the weight of neglect, bullying, and abuse. These experiences shaped how she saw herself and how she related to others. Like many children who grow up without consistent love or care, she searched for validation elsewhere. When she was 16, Tracy entered her first serious relationship. The man she met was 17, just a year older than her, and at first their connection seemed like something positive. For a girl who had grown up surrounded by instability, this relationship offered a kind of attention and belonging she had not experienced before. But there was already a layer of secrecy. Tracy had lied about her age when they first met, making herself seem older than she was. The man believed she was in her 20s, not a vulnerable teenager. By the time he discovered the truth, he was already deeply involved with her. Despite the deception, the relationship continued, and soon it became serious enough for them to marry. This man was not like the others Tracy had grown up watching in her mother's life. He worked hard, holding down several jobs to support them. He was described as responsible and caring, a husband who cooked, cleaned, and looked after the home. He was not violent. He was not abusive. By many accounts, he was the kind of man who might have helped Tracy find a more stable path. Together, they began a family. Tracy gave birth to her first children, 3 daughters. The marriage, at least on the surface, looked like it might offer the stability she had never known as a child. For a time, it seemed as if she had found something good. But Tracy was not free from her past. The instability of her upbringing, the chaos she had absorbed as normal, and the patterns of dysfunction remained inside her. Even with a hard-working husband and a growing family, she struggled. The cycle of pain and poor choices had not been broken. When her son Peter, the little boy who would later be known to the world as Baby P, was born, everything could have changed. His arrival should have been a new chapter filled with hope. But soon after his birth, Tracy's life would again veer toward chaos, and the decisions she made would bring danger into her children's lives. On the 1st of March 2006, Tracy Connolly gave birth to her 4th child, a baby boy named Peter. For her, this was a different experience. Until then, she had been a mother to 3 daughters. The arrival of a son was meant to be something special, a moment of joy, a chance for a new beginning. Peter's father was Tracy's husband at the time. Unlike many of the men she had known before, he worked hard and tried to build a steady life. People who knew him described him as a good man, someone who provided for his family, cooked meals, cleaned the home, and wanted to be a present father. He was not abusive. He was not neglectful. He did his best to keep his family together. For a short while after Peter's birth, it looked as though things might finally move in the right direction. Tracy had a partner who cared, 4 children in total, and a home where stability could have been possible. But the shadows of her past and her tendency to fall into destructive choices soon resurfaced. The marriage began to break down not long after Peter was born. Tracy became involved with another man, Stephen Barker. She met him while she was still living with her husband, and the connection grew quickly. Barker was not the kind of man who could bring stability. He was known for violent tendencies, disturbing interests, and a deeply troubled background. Despite this, Tracy allowed him into her life, and soon into her home. The presence of Barker created tension, and ultimately ended her marriage. Peter's father, though he separated from Tracy, remained involved in his son's life. He continued to see Peter, determined not to be an absent parent. But his influence was limited, and the daily care of the children now lay with Tracy. From this point onward, Peter's life began to change. What should have been a safe and loving environment was becoming dangerous. Barker's presence would bring instability, violence, and fear into the household. For Tracy's children, and especially for Peter, this was the beginning of a dark chapter. When Peter was born in March 2006, it should have been a happy time for the family. For Tracy, having a son after 3 daughters felt like something different, almost like a fresh start. Many parents described the joy of holding a newborn, and for a while it seemed this child might bring some light into her life. But within only a few months, cracks began to appear. The relationship with her husband, Peter's father, broke apart. The separation was caused largely by Tracy's involvement with another man, Stephen Barker, whom she had met in a pub. Their connection grew quickly, and soon Barker was spending time at her home. This new presence in her life caused tension, and her marriage could not survive it. Peter's father left the home, though he stayed determined to remain in his son's life. He visited regularly, cared for him when he could, and tried to provide some stability. But the daily reality was that Tracy now had full control of Peter's care. With Barker increasingly involved, that control was slipping into dangerous territory. Tracy had always struggled with boundaries, and this period showed it clearly. Instead of protecting her children from instability, she opened the door to it. Barker became part of the household, and with him came a background of cruelty and violence that should have kept him far away from children. For Peter, only a baby, the shift was enormous. A home that might have been safe with his father present was now filled with risk. His mother's choices were pulling him into an environment where chaos would soon replace comfort. The early months of Peter's life, which should have been about growth, safety, and care, were instead the beginning of exposure to danger. The decisions Tracy made, the people she allowed inside her home, and the men she surrounded herself with set the stage for everything that followed. And Barker's history, already troubling, would only make matters worse as time went on. When Stephen Barker entered Tracy Connolly's life, everything began to unravel even faster. He was not a man who could offer safety or care. His history was already filled with warning signs, and his presence around children should have raised alarm from the very start. Barker was a troubled figure. He had grown up in a family where abuse was common. As a child, he was mistreated, and instead of finding help, he carried that pain forward. But what made him truly dangerous was how he expressed it. From a young age, Barker displayed disturbing behaviors. He was cruel to animals, something often seen as an early sign of deeper violence. One of his brothers later told investigators how Stephen would catch frogs, skin them alive, and even break their legs just to watch them suffer. This was not the act of a curious child. It was deliberate cruelty carried out to cause pain. This enjoyment of suffering was not limited to animals. Barker also targeted his younger brother. He would hurt him, bully him, and torment him. Violence became his way of dealing with the world. He seemed to take pleasure in the fear and pain of others. As he grew older, these behaviors only deepened. He became known as someone who was sadistic and controlling. People who knew him described him as cruel. At the same time, his intellectual abilities were limited. He was described as having a mild learning disability, and those around him often called him a simpleton. But while he might not have been clever in the usual sense, he was still manipulative and dangerous. Another disturbing part of Barker's character was his obsession with Nazis. He collected paraphernalia, symbols, and items linked to fascism. This fascination was not about history or study. It was about power, control, and intimidation. It reflected the darker side of his personality. Despite all of this, Tracy allowed him into her life and into her home. To her, he was exciting, physically attractive, and intoxicating in those early moments. Instead of seeing the danger, she became infatuated. She overlooked the warning signs. For Tracy's children, this decision was devastating. A man with a history of cruelty, violence, and disturbing obsessions was now living under the same roof as them. And for baby Peter, who was just beginning his life, it meant he would grow up in the presence of someone capable of great harm. This was the beginning of a household that would soon spiral into chaos, because Barker did not arrive alone. His brother, Jason Owen, was also about to enter the picture. Stephen Barker was not the only one who entered Tracy Connolly's life. Along with him came his older brother, Jason Owen. When Jason moved into the home, the situation for Tracy's children became even more dangerous. Jason had his own history of violence, crime, and chaos. By the time he appeared in Tracy's world, he was already a father of 4 children himself, but his life was filled with destruction. He was known as a crack cocaine addict, an arsonist, and a man with a violent past. His criminal record stretched back years, and he carried with him the same disturbing beliefs as his brother. Like Barker, Jason was also a far-right sympathizer, involved with extremist groups such as the National Front. Jason's behavior was marked by cruelty. When he was only 13, he had already been accused of raping an 11-year-old girl. Later in life, he had targeted an Asian family, showing his racist beliefs in violent ways. These were not isolated mistakes, they were part of who he was. Despite all of this, Jason found his way into Tracy's home. He did not come quietly either. He moved in along with 3 of his own children. Tracy, who was already struggling with her 4 children, now had a house full of even more young lives. Added to this were large dogs, including a Rottweiler, and snakes kept as pets. The environment was unstable, crowded, and unsafe. Inside that house, chaos became the daily reality. The adults who filled it, Tracy, Barker, and Jason, each carried their own dysfunction, and together they created a place of danger. Instead of warmth and security, the children were surrounded by aggression, addiction, and neglect. For baby Peter, only 15 months old at the time, this was the world he was growing up in. He was trapped in a home where his caregivers were violent men with criminal pasts and a mother who allowed them inside without question. This combination of Tracy's poor choices, Barker's cruelty, and Jason's criminality formed what investigators later called a perfect storm. It was a household filled with people who should never have been near children, yet they were given free access to them. And as time went on, Peter began to show the first visible signs of what was happening behind closed doors. By late 2006, the home where baby Peter lived had become a place of danger and disorder. What should have been a safe space for a child was instead filled with chaos. The house was crowded. Tracy Connolly, her children, Stephen Barker, Jason Owen, and Jason's own children were all under the same roof. Large dogs roamed the property, including a Rottweiler that Barker often used to intimidate. Snakes were kept as pets, the rooms were cluttered and dirty, and the smell of urine filled the air. Social workers would later describe it as unclean and unsafe. Inside this environment, Peter began to show the first signs that something was terribly wrong. In December 2006, he was only 9 months old when he was taken to hospital with bruising. Doctors found marks on his face, his chest, his shoulder, and his back. These injuries were serious enough that the hospital referred the matter to a child abuse investigation team. For a short time, Peter was removed from his mother's care and placed with a relative. Tracy and her mother were even arrested for assault. In those days away from her, Peter experienced something different: safety, care, and comfort. For a moment, he was free from the people who hurt him. But this did not last. Despite the warnings, despite the investigation, Peter was soon returned to Tracy. Social services had placed him on the Child Protection Register, but they still allowed him to go back to the very place where the danger existed. After his return, the abuse did not stop. In early 2007, Peter was taken once again to the doctor with swelling to his face and head. His mother claimed he had been pushed into a fireplace by another child. The explanation did not match the seriousness of his injuries. Still, he was sent home. By June 2007, social workers carried out an unannounced visit to the house. What they found was alarming. Peter was lying on the sofa, his face red and bruised, with more marks under his chin and across his body. He had 12 bruises in total. His mother was arrested again, but she denied any abuse, even describing herself as a damn good mother. Despite the evidence, Peter was once more returned to her care. By this time, even his behavior was showing signs of distress. He was seen hitting his own head against hard surfaces, something that can happen when a child is in pain or trying to cope with trauma. He was withdrawn, eating soil from a plant pot in the garden when a social worker visited. These were desperate signs, but they were missed or dismissed. Peter's short life had already been filled with injuries, hospital visits, and repeated warnings. He was on the Child Protection Register, He had been seen by doctors and social workers many times, yet still the cycle continued. And as the summer of 2007 went on, the signs of abuse grew even more severe. By the summer of 2007, baby Peter's life had already been marked by repeated injuries, warnings, and brief removals from his mother's care. Yet despite all of this, he always ended up back in the same dangerous home. On the 1st of June 2007, social workers visited unannounced. What they found was deeply concerning. Peter was lying on the sofa with a red face, bruises under his chin, and several more marks across his body. In total, 12 bruises were recorded. His mother was arrested again, but under questioning, she denied harming him. She insisted she was a damn good mother. The investigation stalled, and once more Peter was sent back. Just weeks later, on the 26th of July 2007, Tracy took Peter to the GP. He had head lice so severe that his scalp was infected. This was not the first time. The infestation showed neglect, a lack of even the most basic care. On the 13th of July, during another visit, a social worker saw Peter in the living room. He was smeared in chocolate, his face and hands covered. Tracy explained it away as a harmless mess, but later, it was revealed that she and Barker had deliberately used chocolate to hide Peter's bruises. What looked like a child who had been eating sweets was actually a cruel attempt to disguise signs of abuse. Still, the visits continued, and the concerns were noted. But the deeper truth, that Peter was being systematically hurt, was not acted upon. By August 2007, the danger became clearer. Senior police officers who reviewed the situation concluded that Peter should not be returned to his mother. They saw the risk, but the local council argued that the evidence threshold for removing him permanently had not been reached. In other words, they claimed there wasn't enough proof, even though the injuries, hospital visits, and repeated warnings told a different story. It was a devastating mistake. On the 1st of August, Peter was seen by a consultant pediatrician, Dr. Sabar Al-Zayyat. At that appointment, Peter was described as miserable and crying. Yet, despite his condition, she wrote that she had no concerns. What she did not detect or did not act upon were the serious injuries Peter already had, including broken bones. The following day, Peter was back home, and the cycle of harm continued. For Peter, each missed chance meant more suffering. For those meant to protect him, each decision not to act brought him closer to tragedy. The opportunities to save him were many, but one by one they slipped away. By August 2007, baby Peter was only 17 months old. His short life had already been marked by pain, neglect, and repeated warnings that were ignored. Now, the final days of his life began to unfold. On the 2nd of August, Tracy Connolly wrote about her day online. She described drinking cocktails, mixing large amounts of alcohol with cola, and becoming drunk. She admitted she had acted, in her own words, like a twat. While she spent her time drinking and lying in bed with Stephen Barker, her children, including Peter, were left to cope with neglect. By the morning of the 3rd of August, Peter's suffering had reached its peak. Tracy claimed she had slept late, leaving the children unattended for hours. When she finally went to check on her son, she found him unresponsive in his cot. His body was stiff, and he was already gone. At 11:36 a.m., an emergency call was made. Paramedics rushed to the semi-detached council house in Tottenham. What they found inside shocked them. The house was filthy, every surface covered in dirt. Fleas infested the rooms. In the kitchen, on the table, was the dismembered corpse of a rabbit. On the floors, both animal and human waste. Nazi paraphernalia decorated the walls, and there were bloodstains on Peter's cot. The scene was one of horror. Paramedics tried desperately to save him. They attempted resuscitation and quickly prepared to take him to Middlesex Hospital. As they carried Peter out, Tracy demanded they wait because she wanted to fetch cigarettes and her handbag. Even in that moment, with her child's life gone, her focus was elsewhere. At 12:20 p.m., Peter was officially pronounced dead at Middlesex Hospital. He was just 17 months old. The post-mortem revealed the truth of his final suffering. Peter had more than 50 separate injuries. Part of his left ear was torn, the tip of one of his fingers was missing, his fingernails and toenails had been deliberately removed. His teeth were damaged, one tooth even found in his stomach, from a blow that had knocked it out. Cigarette burns marked his skin, but the most serious injuries were internal. His spine had been broken by hyperextension, as though he had been bent over a banister or cot with immense force. 7 of his ribs were fractured, injuries that required brutal pressure. His shin bone had been broken weeks earlier, left untreated. Despite all these injuries, just 2 days before, a consultant pediatrician had examined him and claimed there were no concerns. Peter had endured months of torment, pain that no child should ever face. His short life ended not in peace, but in suffering. And now, with his death, a murder investigation began. When Peter's death was confirmed at Middlesex Hospital, the case immediately became a police matter. Officers arriving at the house saw conditions that raised suspicion. The filth, the chaos, the Nazi paraphernalia on the walls, and the neglect told a story before a single question was asked. Tracy Connolly was arrested on the very same day her son died. At the time, she was pregnant with her 5th child. Stephen Barker and Jason Owen, knowing what was coming, fled the area. They left Tottenham and tried to hide in Epping Forest, living at a campsite. Their disappearance only increased police suspicions. For 11 days, they remained out of reach, but eventually they were spotted. A campsite owner recognized them and alerted police. Both men were arrested, taken into custody, and charged alongside Tracy. The charges were serious: causing or allowing the death of a child under Section 5 of the Domestic Violence Crime and Victims Act 2004. All 3 denied responsibility. None admitted guilt. Tracy tried to distance herself from the abuse. She claimed she had no idea what was happening to her son, even though the injuries were clear and she had lived in the same house. She insisted she was not directly involved, saying that if anything had happened, it must have been Barker or Owen. Jason Owen also denied harming Peter. During questioning, he even accused his brother Barker of being the one responsible, saying he had once seen him sweaty and excited after being near the child. Barker, for his part, flatly denied everything. He claimed he had never laid a hand on Peter. Despite these denials, police built their case. The evidence showed that Peter had been injured repeatedly over many months. He had been seen more than 60 times by health and social care professionals. He had been on the Child Protection Register. And yet, despite all of these interventions, he had died under extreme and violent circumstances. The trial was set for the Old Bailey at the end of 2008. The charges of murder against Tracy and Owen were dropped because the judge ruled there was not enough evidence to prove intention to kill. Instead, the focus of the case was on whether they had caused or allowed Peter's death. It was a difficult case, filled with horrific details, photographs, and medical reports. For the jury, the task was to look past the excuses and see the reality of what had happened in that house. The story of baby Peter, now known across the country, was moving into the courtroom, and the whole nation was about to learn of the suffering he endured. The trial of Tracy Connolly, Stephen Barker, and Jason Owen began at the Old Bailey near the end of 2008. By this time, the story of baby Peter had already reached the public, but the courtroom revealed details that were even harder to hear. All 3 defendants pleaded not guilty. The murder charges against Tracy and Jason Owen had already been dropped by the judge due to what was described as insufficient evidence. The court would instead decide whether they had caused or allowed Peter's death. Barker and Owen also denied any direct role in harming him. Inside the courtroom, each defendant tried to shift blame. Tracy claimed she had no idea what was happening to her son. She acted as though she was unaware of the abuse, insisting she would never hurt him. Owen pointed at his brother Barker, saying he had once seen him sweaty and excited after being alone with the child. Barker in turn denied it all. He said he had never harmed Peter, calling any accusation against him a lie. The trial was filled with disturbing evidence. Doctors and experts described Peter's injuries. Over 50 marks, fractures, burns, and scars told the story of repeated, deliberate harm. The court heard how Peter had been seen more than 60 times by health and social care workers in the months before his death. The system had been warned. But still, he had not been saved. To avoid traumatizing the jury further, the court showed computer-generated images of Peter's injuries rather than the real photographs. Even the reconstructed images were shocking. They revealed bruises, cuts, and swelling that no child should ever endure. Throughout the hearings, Tracy tried to control how she appeared. When jurors were present, she acted anxious, lowered her eyes, and cried. When they were absent, she was more relaxed, even playful, showing a different face entirely. The contrast did not go unnoticed. The jury listened to days of testimony, balancing the evidence with the defendant's denials. None of the three accepted responsibility. None admitted the truth of what had happened inside that house. By the end of the trial, the jury was faced with a choice to decide whether Tracy Connolly, Stephen Barker, and Jason Owen were guilty of allowing or causing the death of baby Peter. And when the verdicts came, the nation reacted with shock. When the jury returned with their decision, the courtroom held its breath. The trial had been long, filled with shocking evidence, and now it was time to hear the outcome. Stephen Barker was found not guilty of murder, but both he and Jason Owen were found guilty of causing or allowing Peter's death. Tracy Connolly was also found guilty of the same charge. None of them had admitted responsibility. None of them showed real remorse. Even after the verdict, they each tried to downplay their role. After the trial, yet another disturbing allegation came to light. Barker and Connolly were both accused of involvement in the rape of a 2-year-old girl. The case was brought to court in April 2009. To protect the new jury from being prejudiced by knowledge of the Baby P case, both defendants appeared under assumed names. The little girl, just 2 years old, became the youngest sexual abuse victim ever to give evidence at the Old Bailey. She described how Barker assaulted her and how Connolly knew but did nothing to stop it. Barker was convicted of rape. Connolly was cleared of direct cruelty in that case, but the allegations added yet another layer of horror to the story. On the 22nd of May 2009, sentencing for both cases took place at the Old Bailey. Before her sentence, Tracy Connolly wrote a handwritten letter to Judge Stephen Kramer. In it, she said she was sorry that she had failed her son and that every day she lived with guilt. But the words rang hollow. The judge described her as selfish, calculating, and manipulative. He said she had chosen her relationship with Barker over the safety of her child. Tracy Connolly received an indefinite sentence for public protection with a minimum term of 5 years. Stephen Barker received a life sentence for the rape conviction with a minimum term of 10 years. He was also given a 12-year sentence for his role in Peter's death to run at the same time. Jason Owen was sentenced indefinitely as well, with a minimum term of 3 years. The judge noted that his greater concern at the time had been keeping his relationship with his 15-year-old girlfriend secret rather than protecting Peter. The sentences caused outrage across the country. Many felt they were far too light for the suffering Peter had endured. People wanted justice for the little boy who had been failed at every turn. But even after sentencing, the story was far from over. Appeals would follow, and the debate over how these crimes had been handled was only just beginning. After the sentences were given, the country reacted with fury. Many felt the punishments were far too light for what had been done to baby Peter. A minimum of 5 years for Tracy Connolly, 10 years for Stephen Barker, and 3 years for Jason Owen. These numbers seemed small compared to the suffering of a 17-month-old child. Yet instead of accepting their fate, all 3 defendants tried to appeal. They argued their sentences were too harsh, despite public anger that they were already too lenient. Jason Owen's appeal led to his sentence being changed from indefinite to a fixed term of 6 years. In effect, he received an extra 3 years, but the change meant he would eventually be released no matter what. For the public, it felt like yet another failure of justice. Meanwhile, Stephen Barker remained defiant. He refused to engage with prison treatment programs. He would not admit responsibility, would not confront his crimes, and showed no interest in rehabilitation. In 2021, when he applied for parole, the request was denied. Officials said he was still a risk, unwilling to face the truth of what he had done. In prison, he had also been attacked by other inmates. A single punch once left him unconscious. Even among prisoners, his crimes were despised. Tracy Connolly's path was different. She was released in 2013, but quickly returned to prison for breaching her parole conditions. At one point, she was reported to have sold indecent photographs of herself, leading to further punishment. She was refused parole several times, in 2015, 2017, and 2019. But in March 2022, her fourth attempt was approved. This decision caused uproar. Then, Justice Secretary Dominic Raab tried to block her release, arguing that the system had drifted away from its duty to protect the public. He called for parole decisions to focus first on victim safety. But despite his opposition, Connolly was set free, placed under strict license conditions. For the public, the idea that Peter's mother could walk the streets again was chilling. Many felt she should never have been released at all. Yet legally, she had served her minimum term, and the law allowed her to return to society. The anger across Britain did not fade. People still remembered the story of baby Peter. They remembered the missed chances, the ignored warnings, and the life lost. And they questioned how those responsible could ever be free again. After Peter's death and the trial, the focus turned to how so many warnings had been missed. The case forced Britain to look at its child protection system. Peter had been seen by doctors, nurses, and social workers more than 60 times in 8 months. He had been placed on the child protection register. He had even been removed from his mother's care 3 times, yet each time he was returned. 2 months before his death, he was sent back again, and that decision proved fatal. The failures were clear. Haringey Council, the local authority responsible, had already faced criticism years earlier for another child abuse case, the murder of 8-year-old Victoria Klein-Bay in 2000. Lessons were supposed to have been learned, but now, with baby Peter, history had repeated itself. A case review was launched. It found that both social services and health services had failed. Warning signs had not been followed. Opportunities to protect Peter had been ignored. Professionals had been deceived by Tracy Connolly's lies, and they had not looked closely enough at the adults living in the house. The Director of Children's Services at Haringey, Sharon Shoesmith, was sacked. Several social workers and managers also lost their jobs. But the controversy did not end there. Shoesmith argued she had been unfairly dismissed and took legal action. She eventually won her case and received a 6-figure payout, which caused even more anger among the public. Social workers became the target of blame. Many people felt they had failed Peter, but others pointed out that the system itself was broken. Caseloads were too heavy. Social workers had too many children to monitor at once. The funding was low and the pressure was enormous. Some argued that it was impossible for them to do their jobs properly under such conditions. Still, for most of the public, one fact remained. A child had died in plain sight of the authorities. Reports were written, visits were made, and meetings were held, but none of it saved Peter. The case showed how dangerous it could be when warnings are ignored and when adults determined to deceive the system succeed in hiding the truth. But even with all the explanations, one fact could not be changed. Baby Peter had been failed. When the findings of the review became public, the reaction across Britain was immediate and fierce. People were horrified that baby Peter had been seen so many times by professionals, yet no one had saved him. Newspapers ran front-page stories with his photograph, a little blonde-haired boy with bright eyes. That image became the face of failure in child protection. People could not understand how such an innocent child had been returned, again and again, to a home filled with danger. The anger was not only about Tracy Connolly, Stephen Barker and Jason Owen. It was also about the system. Many felt social services had completely failed in their duty. Some believed the authorities cared more about procedures and paperwork than about the child himself. Politicians spoke out. The government was pressed to act. The public demanded accountability. People marched, held vigils, and called for tougher laws to protect children at risk. The phrase "baby P" became a symbol of neglect, not just by his family, but by those meant to safeguard him. For social workers, the case changed everything. They faced heavier criticism and closer scrutiny. Every decision they made in future cases would be questioned. Some said the case created a culture of fear, where social workers became more likely to remove children quickly rather than risk being blamed for another tragedy. But despite all the noise, the reality could not be undone. Peter's life was gone. The outrage, the protests, and the debates all came too late for him. The case had shaken the country. It left people asking how many other children might still be living in the same kind of danger. And as the years passed, the name Baby P remained a reminder of a boy whose short life was marked by suffering, and of a system that let him down. The death of baby Peter left a scar on Britain that has never truly healed. His case became one of the most widely discussed child protection failures in the country's history. The government ordered inquiries, reports were written, new rules were introduced to make sure cases like his would not be ignored again. Politicians promised change, and training for social workers was reviewed. Safeguarding procedures were rewritten, but many people felt the lessons had already been taught before. 7 years earlier, the murder of 8-year-old Victoria Climby had exposed similar failures within the same council, Haringey. Promises were made then too, yet somehow the same mistakes were repeated and another child was lost. For Tracy Connolly, Stephen Barker and Jason Owen, prison did not erase the anger of the public. Connolly was released and recalled more than once, her freedom sparking outrage every time. Barker remained in prison, refusing to face his crimes. Owen was eventually freed under a new identity. For the country, the case became more than just a tragedy. It became a symbol of broken trust. People expected the system to protect the most vulnerable. Instead, it had failed in plain sight. Baby Peter's story changed how people viewed child protection. Social workers became more cautious, sometimes removing children quickly rather than risk another disaster. Families were watched more closely. But the debate continued. How to balance protecting children with supporting parents, and how to make sure no child slipped through the cracks again. In the end, the legacy of baby Peter was not only in the laws and the inquiries, but in the way his name stayed in the memory of the nation. His photograph, the image of an innocent boy who should have been safe, remained a reminder of what happens when warnings are ignored. He was a child who never had the chance to grow, to laugh freely, or to live the life he deserved. His story forced Britain to face hard truths about neglect, cruelty, and responsibility. And though those responsible for his suffering served their sentences, the real punishment was the memory they left behind. A memory of a boy who suffered in silence while the world looked away. That silence still speaks, and it asks a question that has no easy answer. How can society make sure there is never another baby Peter? And so, the story of baby Peter comes to an end, a heartbreaking reminder of how innocence can be lost when protection fails. His short life still echoes as a warning, not just in Britain but around the world, about the cost of neglect and cruelty. But as difficult as this case is, it is only one of many. Each story reminds us of the same truth, that behind every headline lies a life, a family, and lessons that cannot be ignored. If you've stayed with me through this story, I ask you not to just listen, but to remember, to learn, and to share it with others. These stories are not told for entertainment alone, but to shine a light on the failures that must never be repeated. Now, as we close the chapter on baby Peter, we open another. Our next story is one that shocked a community in an entirely different way. A crime where trust was broken and lives were shattered by choices no one could have imagined. So settle in and stay with me as we step carefully into the next case. Story 2. The woods were quiet that October morning in 1983. The kind of silence you notice only when it feels unnatural, heavy, almost waiting. On the edge of Griffin, Georgia, a small group of boys wandered through the fields. They weren't doing anything unusual, just chasing squirrels, carrying their rifles the way kids in the countryside often did back then. For them, it was supposed to be a normal Saturday, a chance to climb trees, laugh, and maybe bring home a squirrel or two. But as they crossed into a clearing, the mood shifted, the laughter stopped. The sound of crunching leaves beneath their shoes felt louder than it should. And then, they saw it. At first, it didn't make sense. Blood spattered across the grass, branches broken, as if there had been a fight, tire tracks carved into the soft ground. It looked like chaos frozen in place. And in the middle of it all, a body. A man, badly beaten and left in a way too brutal for young eyes. His clothes torn, his body broken. The boys could only stand there, frozen. They didn't understand the full horror of what they were looking at, but they knew one thing. Something terrible had happened here. The woods were deathly still now. Whatever violence had taken place was over, but the silence carried weight, as though the land itself was holding on to the memory of the struggle. One boy whispered for the others not to move. Another turned to run. Before long, they were racing back towards safety, their young hearts pounding, desperate to find someone, anyone, who could make sense of what they had seen. That field, only a short drive from downtown Griffin, had just become the center of a nightmare, and the man they found would soon be identified as 23-year-old Timothy Coggins. But in that moment, all that existed was fear, blood, and the chilling certainty that something unspeakable had happened in their town. Timothy Coggins was known by everyone who crossed his path. In Griffin, Georgia, he wasn't just another young man in his 20s. He was family, he was a friend, he was a neighbor people remembered. Tim grew up with his mother, Viola, and his stepfather, Robert Longsword. Together with 3 brothers and 4 sisters, the house was always full. They didn't have much money, but they had what mattered: big dinners, loud laughter, and relatives dropping by. His mother had a way of filling a room with warmth, and Tim was devoted to her. One of his nieces remembered him years later. She was only 6 back then, but she said if his mother had asked him to walk all the way to Atlanta just to bring back a pastry, he would have done it. That was Tim. Loyal, dependable, willing to do anything for the people he loved. But Tim wasn't only a son and a brother. He had a personality that drew people in. He was funny. He had that smile that could light up a room, pearly white teeth, and an easy charm. People wanted to be around him, and he wanted to be around them too. He had friends everywhere, and he loved a good party. By 1983, Tim was 23 years old. He worked as a handyman alongside his stepfather. He earned his living with his hands, but he carried himself with confidence, and when he went out, people noticed him. That October, on a Friday night, Tim made plans to head to the People's Choice nightclub. He wasn't going alone. He got a ride with a friend, Jesse Gates, a sheriff's deputy. As they drove, the 2 men talked. Somewhere in that conversation, Tim mentioned something that made Jesse pause. Tim had been seeing a woman. She was white. Jesse's tone changed. He warned his friend with a seriousness Tim couldn't ignore. "Griffin isn't Atlanta," he told him. "Some people here don't accept things like that." The warning hung in the air, but the car kept moving, and soon the 2 of them pulled up outside the club. That night, something unusual caught their attention. At the entrance of the People's Choice, 3 white men stood waiting. In Griffin, many places were still segregated in practice, even if not by law. White men rarely came to this nightclub. Their presence felt out of place. Still, Tim didn't hesitate. He headed inside. For the black community in Griffin, People's Choice was the spot on a Friday night. The music played loud. Marvin Gaye, Maze, and Frankie Beverly, Michael Jackson's Thriller. Drinks were flowing, barbecue smoke filled the air, and people danced shoulder to shoulder. Tim's sister, Talisa, was there too. She adored her big brother. He had taught her how to ride a bike when she was a little girl. Now, she watched him laughing, dancing, moving through the crowd like the center of attention he often was. But she wasn't the only one watching him that night. For the past few weeks, Tim had been dancing at the club with a white woman. In his eyes, friendship and love crossed all boundaries. But in Griffin, Georgia, that wasn't how everyone saw it. At one point, Talisa went to the bathroom. Inside, she overheard something that made her uneasy. People were saying that white men were looking for Tim. When she stepped back out, she saw her brother leaving. He was walking behind a white man. To her, it didn't seem strange. Tim was friendly with everyone. She thought he was just stepping out to talk or hang out, but that was the last time she ever saw him alive. The next day, the family noticed his absence. Still, no one panicked. Tim was known to party, to spend nights with friends, to crash on someone's couch. They told themselves he was probably just sleeping off a long night. But Sunday would come, and with it, the truth. 2 days passed, and there was still no sign of Timothy Coggins. To his family, it wasn't unusual at first. He was young, he loved to be out with friends, and he often stayed away from home after a long night of partying. They tried to believe he was safe, maybe resting on someone's couch, maybe laughing somewhere in town. But on Sunday morning, October 9th, everything changed. On the outskirts of Griffin, in a poor area called Sunnyside, a group of kids were out hunting squirrels. Some were teenagers, one was just 10 years old. They carried their rifles and moved across an open field near a trailer park called Carey's mobile home. Overhead, power lines stretched across the land, and in the middle of the field stood a massive oak tree, known locally as the Hanging Tree. It was a place where people sometimes gathered, partied, or dealt drugs. But that morning, the tree was different. The boys noticed something lying on the ground. At first, they weren't sure what it was. As they moved closer, the shape became clear. A body. A young black man, brutally beaten and left in the dirt. The kids froze. Some stared, unable to look away. Others wanted to run. It was a sight no child should ever have to see. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, the chaos of what had happened became clear. The ground told its own story. Drag marks stretched across the field. Bloodstains covered the soil. Tire tracks cut through the grass. An empty bottle of bourbon lay discarded nearby. A sweater was torn and crumpled. It was obvious there had been a violent struggle, one that went on for hundreds of feet. Investigators believed the victim had been chained to the back of a vehicle and dragged. But that wasn't what killed him. The body was taken to the coroner's office. A black sheriff's deputy named Oscar Jordan was called in to help identify the victim. When he saw the body, he could barely take it in. The man's bottom teeth were missing. His arms were covered in stab wounds, as though he had tried to fight off his attacker. His lungs had been punctured. He had been stabbed dozens of times. And across his chest, his killer had carved an X. Decades later, Jordan would still remember the worst part. The autopsy showed that the man had not been killed quickly. He had bled out slowly, left behind a pile of wood logs, abandoned to die. The body was so damaged, so disfigured, that even Jordan could not immediately say who it was. Officers spread out across Griffin with photos, searching for answers. Eventually, they knocked on the door of a young woman named Talisa Coggins. They showed her the pictures, asking if she knew who it was. She shook her head. She couldn't bring herself to recognize the victim. But later, another relative confirmed the truth. The man lying in that field was Timothy Coggins. For his sister Talisa, the news struck like a blow. Just days earlier, she had danced beside him at the People's Choice nightclub. Now, she had to face the reality that her brother was gone, murdered in a way almost too cruel to believe. And somewhere out there, his killer was still free. Timothy Coggins' funeral was closed casket. His injuries were too severe for his family to see him one last time. The house was crowded with relatives that night, so crowded that the children had to sleep on the floor. But no one wanted to be alone. Fear hung over the family. Tim was gone, and now the only thing his loved ones could cling to was the hope of justice. The Spalding County Sheriff's Department launched its official investigation. They worked with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, since GBI often handled crimes in rural areas. Two deputies, Oscar Jordan, the same man who had helped identify Tim's body, and Jesse Gates, the deputy who had dropped Tim off at the nightclub, became part of the team. For them, this was not just another case, it was personal. Investigators started with what they knew. Tim was young, he had friends everywhere, and he loved to party. But there were other parts of his life too. He sometimes sold drugs, often to white customers. His side business wasn't large, but it was risky. Combined with the fact that he had been seen with a white woman, it painted a dangerous picture. Deputies Jordan and Gates formed a theory. Maybe Tim owed money to someone white in a drug deal. Maybe his relationship with the woman had pushed racists in Griffin into a rage. Maybe both. Either way, they believed this was why Tim was killed. Their attention soon turned to Carey's mobile home park, the same place near the field where Tim's body had been found. It was known as home to people with criminal pasts, and some of its residents had reputations for violence. Two names came up quickly: Frankie Gebhardt and Bill Moore, brothers-in-law. Locals called them frequent flyers at the courthouse because of how often they were in trouble with the law. Gebhardt in particular was feared. He had dropped out of school in the 6th grade and worked as a logger. But outside of work, he was known for wild, drug-fueled parties that often spiraled into shocking scenes. Once, he had even butchered a cow in a kitchen, not for food, but for spectacle. When investigators questioned Gebhardt about the night of October 7th, his answers were shaky. He gave an alibi, but it didn't seem strong. Strangely, Bill Moore was not interviewed at all. And then, just 4 days later, the investigation suddenly stopped. Deputy Oscar Jordan was told they had reached a dead end. Deputy Jesse Gates was removed from the case completely. His superiors said he was only a road deputy, not an investigator. No more explanation was given. For Jordan and Gates, the decision felt wrong. For Gates especially, it carried deep guilt. He had been the one to take Tim to the club that night. Now, he wondered if someone at Carey's mobile home park had pressured the sheriff's office into shutting the case down. In the media, the murder of Timothy Coggins barely made a ripple. Newspapers gave more attention to a missing white girl in Marietta. Tim's death was left in silence, as though it didn't matter. To the wider world, Timothy Coggins was gone, forgotten, but not to his family, and not to those who wanted them to stay silent. One night, Tim's stepfather Robert received a phone call. A voice warned that more members of the family would die if the police kept asking questions. Another night, as Talisa and her relatives sat watching television, a brick smashed through their window. Attached to it was a note. The message was short and terrifying. "You're next." Robert also drove a school bus as part of his work. One morning, he climbed aboard and found a blood-soaked shirt left behind. He called officers to investigate, but they never followed up with him. And then came the most chilling act of all. One day, the Coggins family discovered a dog inside their home. It was dead. Its head had been cut off. Whether these attacks came from Tim's killers or from others trying to terrorize them, the message was the same: be afraid, stay quiet. The family was too frightened to even put a headstone on Tim's grave. They feared it would be vandalized. They carried their grief in silence, with no justice, no closure. The case of Timothy Coggins went cold, and as the years passed, it seemed like it would stay that way forever. Investigator Oscar Jordan had tried to hold on to hope, but over time, even he accepted the truth. Timothy's murder had not been given the attention it deserved. He believed it was because Tim was black, and in Griffin, that fact alone had determined how much effort people would give. The Coggins family carried their grief quietly. They learned to live with fear. For them, closure seemed impossible. They avoided drawing attention because each reminder of Tim's death was met with threats. They never placed a headstone on his grave. They believed if they did, it would be destroyed. Their only choice was to mourn in silence, to remember him privately, and to pray for justice that never came. 33 years went by. Tim's sisters grew older. His brothers carried on with their lives, and his mother Viola continued to live with her pain. But the memory of Tim never left them. Then, in February 2016, something unexpected happened. Viola fell seriously ill. Diabetes had weakened her body. Her kidneys began to fail. She lay in the hospital, weak, barely able to eat. Her daughter, Talisa, stayed by her side. She cared for her mother, playing Tim's favorite gospel songs to ease her suffering. One day, as the music played, Viola spoke words that startled her daughter. She said, "I ain't going to be here for it, but they're going to get who killed Tim." For Talisa, the words felt almost like a prophecy. Was her mother only expressing hope that justice would come someday, or was she saying something more? Just days later, on February 23, 2016, Viola passed away. A year went by, and the Coggins family still lived with the wound that had never healed. But then, in 2017, news came that none of them had expected. The district attorney's office reached out. They were reopening Timothy's case, and this time, they said, they knew who killed him. Every 6 months, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation reviewed its unsolved cases. Even cold cases, no matter how old, were reassigned to new investigators who might notice details others had missed. That's how, more than 30 years after Timothy's death, his file landed on the desk of Special Agent Jared Coleman. Coleman was only 2 years into his job, still young, still building experience. But when he looked at the file, he immediately felt the weight of it. The folder was thin. Much of the evidence from 1983 had disappeared. The only items left were Timothy's jeans and his underwear. But what caught Coleman's attention were the notes. They mentioned 2 men, Frankie Gebhardt and Bill Moore, brothers-in-law. Both had lived at Carey's mobile home park, close to where Tim's body was found. Coleman couldn't understand why. Back in 1983, these men had barely been investigated. And as he looked deeper, he found something else. A clue from 2007. That year, one of the boys who had discovered Tim's body as a child, Christopher Vaughn, was in prison. By then, Vaughn had fallen into a life of crime. He was serving time for child molestation and felony charges. From his cell, he had written to the GBI. In his letter, he claimed he had once heard Frankie Gebhardt confess to the murder. According to Vaughn, Gebhardt bragged that he killed Tim with a knife, then threw the weapon down a well near his trailer. He said the reason was simple. Tim had been with Gebhardt's girlfriend, a white woman named Ruth Elizabeth Guy, known as Mickey. Was Mickey the same white woman seen with Tim at the club? Coleman couldn't be sure, but he did know that Mickey had left Georgia only weeks after the murder. It was the kind of thing someone might do if they found themselves caught in a dangerous situation. Unfortunately, she had died in 2010, so her side of the story could never be told. Back in 2007, the GBI had ignored Vaughn's letter. Maybe they thought he was lying to reduce his sentence. Maybe they didn't want to reopen old wounds. But in 2017, Coleman decided to track him down. In April of that year, Coleman interviewed Vaughn in prison. Vaughn admitted he had hoped to shorten his sentence when he first told the story, but he stood by his claim. He insisted he was telling the truth, that Gebhardt had bragged about killing Timothy, about stabbing him, and about throwing the knife into the well. For Coleman, the pieces were starting to fit together, but he knew he needed help. At the same time, Spalding County had a new sheriff, Darrell Dix. He was a man with his own complicated past. As a teenager, he had been a troubled white kid in Griffin. By his own admission, he was a homeless drunk who could easily have fallen into the same life as men like Gebhardt. But instead, he found religion, straightened his path, joined the police, and was eventually elected sheriff in January 2017. For Dix, one of his goals was to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the black community. When Agent Coleman reached out to him about Timothy's case, Dix was ready to listen. But there was another reason Dix felt so strongly. Not long after taking office, he had found an old notebook in the police archives. It belonged to an officer from the 1980s who had gone undercover in the Ku Klux Klan. In May 1982, that officer wrote something disturbing. A Klan leader had told him that several people in local law enforcement were members. The officer added, "At this point, I'm unsure who to trust. I'll try to find out who in the department is Klan." Reading that, Sheriff Dix wondered if Timothy's case had been deliberately sabotaged back then. Not just ignored, but covered up by white supremacists working inside law enforcement. In 1983, deputies Jordan and Gates had suspected someone at Carey's mobile home park had pressured the sheriff's office to stop investigating. Now, decades later, Dix thought the truth might have been even worse. Perhaps Timothy's death was not just overlooked because of racism. Perhaps it was protected by men who wanted to send a message. Determined to right old wrongs, Dix joined forces with Agent Coleman. He assigned one of his deputies to work alongside him. Together, they set out to uncover what really happened to Timothy Coggins. And soon, they would hear stories that made the case darker than they ever imagined. By 2017, Agent Jared Coleman was convinced that Timothy Coggins' death was about more than a personal dispute. It was about race. The evidence, the confessions, the silence that followed, it all pointed in one direction. Coleman went so far as to call it what it truly was. a lynching. In American history, a lynching was the killing of someone without a trial, carried out to send a message, often in public. Thousands of black Americans had been lynched in the 19th and 20th centuries. Many of those killings were tied to accusations that a black man had been involved with a white woman. Timothy's case fit the same pattern. As Coleman and Sheriff Darrell Dix reopened the investigation, they began to gather new testimony. Locals who had lived near Carey's mobile home park came forward. The stories were disturbing. People said that both Frankie Gebhardt and Bill Moore had bragged about killing Timothy. They claimed the two men believed they were protecting the white race. One witness said Moore himself had once remarked that he missed the good old days when you could kill a black man for no reason. Others repeated similar stories, that Gebhardt and Moore had laughed, told the tale, and carried their pride in what they had done. Coleman tried to interview Bill Moore. Moore denied everything. He said he had never even heard of Timothy Coggins. The lie was obvious, but Moore stuck to it. Next, Coleman visited Gebhardt. By that time, Gebhardt was already in jail on unrelated sexual assault charges. Coleman asked him about the night of the murder. Gebhardt pretended to know nothing, but when Coleman pressed about the weapon, asking if he had thrown a knife into the well on his property, Gebhardt snapped. "Well, you'll come out there and dig my well up then," he said. It was as close to a challenge as it was to a denial. Sheriff Dix took the remark seriously. He began preparing to do exactly what Gebhardt had dared them to. By the summer of 2017, news began to spread. Sheriff Dix told the media they were close to making an arrest in Timothy's case. He said they just needed more people to come forward. It was partly true, but partly strategy. The investigators had almost no physical evidence left. Most of what had been collected in 1983 had been lost. The hair samples from Timothy's jeans, the bourbon bottle from the field, even basic items that could have been tested for DNA years later. Without those, the case was built almost entirely on witness testimony, stories, rumors, memories, many of them decades old. So Sheriff Dix played a careful game. He wanted people to believe arrests were close, to make others nervous, to shake more witnesses loose. The gamble worked. More people began to talk. One man said that back in the 1980s, Gebhardt himself had told him the story, how he chained Timothy to a truck, and how Moore was the one who stabbed him. A woman who had managed the trailer park remembered hearing Bill Moore's sister, who was also Gebhardt's wife, talk about what was going to happen. Drunk and upset one night, she had said, "I'm telling you, he's going to kill him. They're going to tie him up, and they're going to drag him with a car or truck." Maybe she hadn't been taken seriously at the time. Maybe she had been too afraid to speak out later. But now, her words added to the weight of the case. With every new account, the evidence against Gebhardt and Moore grew. Witness after witness confirmed what investigators already believed. These men had committed the crime, and they had been proud of it. Finally, in October 2017, more than 3 decades after Timothy's murder, charges were filed. Frankie Gebhardt and Bill Moore were arrested for concealing a death, aggravated assault, aggravated battery, murder, and felony murder. For the first time in 34 years, Timothy Coggins' family felt a shift. Justice was not yet in their hands, but it was finally moving toward them. And for investigator Oscar Jordan, the man who had been forced to walk away back in 1983, the moment carried special meaning. Sheriff Dix made sure of it. He gave Jordan the chance to take part in the arrests. He even handed him the pair of handcuffs used on Gebhardt. Jordan wept as he accepted them. "You've waited 34 years for this," Dix told him. "You've earned them." It was a symbolic act, but a powerful one. After decades of silence, the truth was finally beginning to break through. The arrests of Frankie Gebhardt and Bill Moore were not ordinary. They carried the weight of 34 years of waiting. Bill Moore chose to avoid a trial. He accepted a manslaughter plea deal. His sentence was 20 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. For the family of Timothy Coggins, it was something, but not enough. Frankie Gebhardt, on the other hand, refused to take a plea. His case would go to trial. The prosecutors preparing to face him were nervous. The truth was, their evidence was thin. They had stories, confessions told in bars and whispered at parties, but little physical proof. Most of what had been collected in 1983 had been lost or destroyed. They had no DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon directly linked to him. The Chief Assistant District Attorney for the Griffin Judicial Circuit, a young prosecutor named Marie Broder, took the case. She was only 34 years old, younger than the murder itself, but she carried her own reason for fighting. Years earlier, her uncle had been stabbed to death. Her family never felt justice had truly been served. That loss had pushed her to become a prosecutor, determined to give other families the closure hers never received. Still, she knew the risks. Gebhardt had a history of violence, but history alone would not be enough in a courtroom. Witness after witness had criminal records of their own. Many were people the jury might struggle to trust: child molesters, drug dealers, white supremacists. The defense would argue they were trash, unreliable voices with nothing to lose. Marie needed something stronger, something physical. Over and over, witnesses mentioned the same detail: the knife. The weapon used to kill Timothy had been thrown down a well near Gebhardt's trailer. For years, it was only talk, but Marie decided it was time to find out the truth. Digging up a well was no simple task. The soil was dangerous, the structure unstable. If they tried to dig it out by hand, the well could collapse. So Marie arranged for something never before used in Georgia for a case like this: a hydrovac system. The system blasted water into the soil, breaking it apart, then vacuumed the mud and debris to the surface. Piece by piece, it pulled up what had been buried for decades. At first, it seemed pointless. The team hauled out buckets of wet dirt, nothing more. Critics said it was a waste of money and time. Some even mocked the effort. One woman, Brandy Abercrombie, Bill Moore's own daughter, scoffed. "They'll find nothing but a bunch of dirt." And there was another risk. If any DNA had once been on the knife, blasting it with water would have washed it away. The weapon had been underground for 34 years. Even if it surfaced, science might not be able to prove it belonged to Timothy's killer. But then, the machine began to deliver results. First, a pair of Adidas shoes, the kind Timothy had worn. Then, a length of chain, like one that could have been used to drag him across the field. Next, a shirt, its fabric pierced with holes shaped like stab wounds. And finally, an old knife, broken into pieces. The sight of the shirt was especially powerful. 7 holes, torn into the back, seemed to echo the violence Timothy had suffered. For prosecutor Marie Broder, the discovery was both haunting and hopeful. She knew DNA would be gone, but the items themselves told a story the jury would see with their own eyes. And for the first time in decades, the possibility of justice began to feel real. As summer of 2018 arrived, the trial of Frankie Gebhardt drew near. For prosecutor Marie Broder, the pressure was heavy. She carried the responsibility not only of a courtroom battle, but of giving the Coggins family something they had waited 34 years to see: justice. She spent time with the family in the weeks before trial. She was kind, but she didn't soften the truth. The process would be painful. They would have to hear every detail, see every piece of evidence, relive the horror of Timothy's death. Marie wanted them prepared. At one gathering, she handed them photographs from the original crime scene, pictures of Timothy's body, broken and brutalized. The family passed them around quietly. Tears fell. Some kissed the photos, unable to let them go. Talisa, Timothy's sister, stayed calm on the outside, but inside, she carried her own fear. As a black woman who had lived her life in Griffin, she had seen racism firsthand. Hope for her did not come easy. When the trial opened, the courtroom filled with tension. The case would last only a week, but every day carried weight. The evidence presented was not simple. Witness after witness took the stand, and nearly all of them had criminal records. Some were drug dealers, others were white supremacists. Even Christopher Vaughn, the man who first told investigators about Gebhardt's confession, was serving time for child molestation. The defense used this to attack the case. They said the prosecution's witnesses were nothing but trash. They compared them to the garbage pulled from the well. They argued that the state had no solid proof, only rumors from unreliable people. But the prosecution pushed back. They presented the physical items from the well, the shoes, the chain, the shirt, the broken knife. They reminded the jury that these items matched the stories told for decades. They brought in witnesses like Oscar Jordan, the former investigator who had seen Timothy's body in 1983. He testified about the brutality of the killing and about the racism in Griffin at the time. 17 different accounts of confession were presented. 17 times over the years, Gebhardt had bragged about what he had done. Marie Broder's closing argument was simple but powerful. Timothy Coggins, she said, had been a young black man in 1983 who refused to follow the unwritten rules of the time. He lived freely. He loved who he chose. And that, for men like Gebhardt, was enough to make him a target. Her team pleaded with the jury. This crime screams anger, it screams hatred, but let it also scream justice. When the jury returned with its decision, the courtroom held its breath. Frankie Gebhardt was found guilty of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, aggravated battery, and concealing a death. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, plus 30 years. As he delivered the sentence, Judge Fletcher Sams looked at Gebhardt and said, "Hopefully, sir, you have stabbed your last victim." For the Coggins family, it was a moment of relief mixed with sorrow. Justice had finally come, but it had taken half a lifetime. And for Griffin, the verdict stood as a rare reckoning, a public acknowledgement of a crime born out of hatred. But even as the family walked out of that courtroom, the question lingered. Had the town truly changed? The guilty verdict against Frankie Gebhardt was a turning point, but it did not erase the pain of what had happened. For Timothy's family, the sentence brought justice, yet it also reopened wounds that had never truly healed. As they left the courtroom, they carried both relief and sorrow. Relief that the man who had taken Timothy's life would never walk free again. Sorrow that it had taken 34 long years to reach this point. But even with the conviction, Griffin itself seemed caught in two worlds. That same year, 2018, the Griffin City Council held a vote. The proposal was to officially recognize April as Confederate History Month. The debate was heated. During the discussion, a former white city commissioner spoke in favor of the designation, using racial slurs in the process. A current commissioner, a black man named Rodney McCord, stood against it. He asked how, as a black resident, he was supposed to celebrate the Confederacy. He argued that honoring such a history only deepened wounds that had never healed. But despite his protest, the measure passed. The official purpose of Confederate History Month was stated as honoring and celebrating the Confederate States of America. For Timothy's family, and for many others, the decision was a bitter reminder. Yes, Gebhardt had been punished. Yes, Timothy's name had been spoken in a courtroom where truth was finally heard. But the deeper divisions in their town still lingered. Still, for the Coggins family, there was at least one change they could hold on to. Timothy no longer lay in an unmarked grave. After so many years of silence and fear, his loved ones finally felt safe enough to honor him properly. They gathered together, released purple balloons into the sky, and placed a headstone at his resting place. It carried his full name, Timothy Wayne Coggins, gone but never forgotten. For his family, those words were more than stone. They were a promise that his story would not disappear again. When the trial ended and the sentence was given, the Coggins family finally felt they could take one step forward. For more than 3 decades, fear had kept them from marking Timothy's grave. They worried a headstone would be vandalized, destroyed, or used as a cruel reminder of their pain. But now, with Gebhardt convicted and more behind bars, they felt strong enough to honor Timothy in the way he deserved. Family members gathered together at the cemetery. They carried purple balloons, each one filled with their love and their memories of the brother, the son, the uncle they had lost. As they released the balloons into the sky, they watched them drift higher, carrying with them a silent message. Timothy was not forgotten. For the first time, his grave bore a headstone. It read simply, Timothy Wayne Coggins, gone but never forgotten. The words spoke to the pain of the past and to the promise of the future. His life had been cut short, but his story would not disappear again. The family stood together, holding on to one another, knowing this moment was something they had once believed would never come. They still carried grief, but alongside it now lived recognition, remembrance, and justice. It had taken 34 years, but Timothy Coggins was no longer just another cold case. His name had been spoken in court, his killers had been held to account, and his grave, once bare, was finally marked with dignity. Yet even with this tribute, questions remained. Had Griffin truly changed? Had the deeper wounds of racism healed? Or would Timothy's story remain a warning of how long justice can take? For the Coggins family, the answers were uncertain. But as they stood at his grave, one thing was clear. Timothy Wayne Coggins would never be forgotten again. The headstone was in place, and the words on it promised Timothy Coggins would never be forgotten. For his family, it was the final act of recognition they had been denied for decades. But around them, the town of Griffin carried on. The trial was over, but the deeper questions remained. The year of the conviction, 2018, showed how divided the community still was. The vote for Confederate History Month had passed. The language used in its defense revealed that the same old attitudes were not entirely gone. For many, it raised a haunting question. Had anything really changed since 1983, when Timothy lost his life for crossing an invisible line? Or had the decades only hidden the truth beneath silence? For Timothy's family, what mattered most was that his story was finally told. His killers were named and judged. His grave, once bare, now carried a marker that declared his worth. 34 years had passed. Threats, fear, silence, and grief had held them captive. But at last, justice had broken through. Timothy Wayne Coggins was gone, but his memory stood strong, and his story, once buried, would never again be silenced. That is the story of Timothy Wayne Coggins, a young man whose life was stolen and whose family carried their pain for more than 3 decades before justice was finally served. If this story touched you, don't just leave in silence. Subscribe now so you never miss the next case. Share this video with someone you care about, because these stories hold lessons, and remembering them is how we honor the lives lost. And before you go, leave a comment for me. Type 1 if you believe justice came too late, or 0 if you believe it was still worth the fight. I want to hear what you think. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. You can now close your eyes, let go of the weight of the story, and drift into the calm. Enjoy the rain sound as you rest.
Bye.